Snow was falling over Chicago that night, soft, steady, almost too quiet for a city that never slept. From the top floor of the Carter Tower, the world below looked small, neat, and perfectly under control. Just like Ethan Carter's life was supposed to be, he had everything people dreamed of: power, wealth, a fiancée whose smile graced magazine covers. But as the city lights flickered across the glass walls of his penthouse, Ethan felt the silence pressing against his chest. Success had never felt so lonely. His phone buzzed another meeting, another headline, another reminder that perfection was a prison built of gold and glass. Somewhere inside, he wondered when he'd last laughed without thinking of an image or obligation. And then, 2 days later, on a flight bound for Zurich, he met her. Clara Reeves, his new assistant, quiet, grounded, and strangely unafraid of his silence. For the first time in years, someone looked at him not as a name, not as a title, but as a man who might still have a heart. This is the story of a billionaire who thought he had it all, until a business trip changed everything and love began where control ended. Let's begin. The city hummed far below, a pulse of headlights and hurried lives beneath the cold glass of the penthouse. Inside, everything was still. Ethan Carter stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of untouched scotch. The ice had already melted. He watched the night stretch over Chicago, endless, glittering, and hollow, a place that never slept, yet somehow made him feel like he was the only one awake. Behind him, the sound of heels echoed against marble. "Ethan! The Cole Foundation wants confirmation for Friday's gala," his assistant's voice called out. He nodded, not turning around. "Tell them we'll be there. It was always we, Ethan and Vanessa, America's golden couple." The visionary CEO and the glamorous entrepreneur, perfectly matched in every photo, every smile, every pose rehearsed to the point. It didn't even feel like pretending anymore. It just felt empty. When the door closed and silence returned, he loosened his tie, his reflection staring back from the window's glass. It looked like him, but not really. The version the world admired was sculpted, edited, controlled. He could close $1 billion deal before breakfast, but couldn't remember the last time he had breakfast without checking his phone. He set the glass down. It landed with a soft clink, the kind that lingers longer than it should. Across the room, the digital clock glowed, 11:47 p.m. Vanessa had texted an hour ago, "Don't wait up. PR dinner ran late." A small part of him was relieved. Another part wondered when late had become the new normal. The penthouse looked like a museum of success, modern art, glass tables, chrome edges polished to perfection, nothing out of place, not a single trace of a real life being lived. The air smelled faintly of cedar and silence. Ethan walked toward the desk by the window, scrolling through tomorrow's agenda on his tablet. Zurich, the merger presentation, renewable energy, the biggest deal of his career. Everything had to be perfect. His reflection watched him again in the glass tall, composed, controlled. He almost laughed. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man leading the future of sustainable power, and yet powerless to feel anything real. He sat down, running a thumb over a photograph half hidden under a stack of reports. It was old him and his father, standing in front of the first Carter Innovations lab. The smile on his father's face was wide, genuine, unguarded. "Work hard, son," his father had said that day. "But don't forget to live." Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. A soft chime broke the silence. An incoming calendar reminder, conference prep, assistant Clara Reeves. He frowned slightly. The name was new. His previous assistant had taken emergency leave. HR had mentioned a replacement. Ethan hadn't paid much attention. He opened the file. A photo appeared, a young woman in her late 20s. Simple smile, brown hair neatly tied back, no flashy resume, no high-profile background, just steady experience, solid recommendations, and a note from HR. "She listens well." He closed the file, but found himself staring at the blank screen for a few seconds longer than usual. Maybe it was the phrase listens well. In his world, people spoke fast, promised faster, but rarely listened. The city lights flickered again on the window pane. Outside, snow began to fall, soft as dust. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For years, he had followed a schedule so tight it could measure his life in 15-minute blocks. Yet, lately, time had started slipping through his hands like sand. He'd built an empire, but somehow lost the reason for building it. His phone buzzed again. A message from Vanessa. "Remember, Zurich is about optics. We need that photo for Forbes. Optics, that word again. The one that reduced everything people, love, even happiness to presentation." He typed a reply, then deleted it. For once, he didn't have anything to say. He turned off the lights. The city outside glowed faintly blue, the lake a dark mirror beyond the skyline. He walked toward the balcony, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold air. The wind bit against his skin, sharp and clean, real. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The hum of traffic below, the faint whistle of wind between buildings. The loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by everything except meaning. Somewhere deep down, he knew this couldn't last. No one can breathe forever inside a glass cage, no matter how beautiful it looks from the outside. When he opened his eyes again, the first snowflakes of winter brushed against his sleeve, melting on contact. He thought of Zurich, of the merger, of the endless faces and handshakes waiting for him. Another performance, another week of being the man everyone wanted to be. And yet, somewhere beneath the weight of routine, a small, quiet thought surfaced. What if something changes? He didn't know how or when, only that the thought felt dangerous, like the crack in the glass before it shatters. Inside, the clock ticked toward midnight. Ethan took one last look at the city, then turned off his phone. For the first time in years, he let the silence stay. He didn't know that. Within 48 hours, on a flight halfway across the world, a young woman with kind eyes and a calm voice would walk into his orbit, and everything carefully built would begin to shift. The snow kept falling, soft as breath against the glass, and somewhere in the quiet, the man in the golden cage finally exhaled. Morning spilled gently through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter Innovations. Pale light slid across chrome desks and glass partitions, touching screens already glowing with deadlines. The office had its own rhythm phones ringing, heels clicking, voices low and efficient, but beneath the hum of precision, there was one person moving differently. Clara Reeves. Her steps were quiet, unhurried, yet she never seemed to fall behind. She had joined the company only 2 months ago, another name on the endless list of assistants supporting executives who lived on caffeine and control. No one paid much attention at first. She was polite but not timid, kind but not naive. She smiled often, though never without reason. She listened, really listened, and somehow that made people tell her more than they meant to. That morning, as others rushed to meet their CEO's impossible standards, Clara carried 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with oat milk and honey, to the assistant's corner desk. She set them down just as Marjorie, Ethan Carter's longtime assistant, stepped off an elevator, her eyes red from sleeplessness. "My son?" Marjorie whispered. "The hospital called. He's not doing well. I have to leave today." Without hesitation, Clara placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Go. Don't worry about anything here. I'll handle it." Marjorie blinked, torn between gratitude and panic. The Zurich trip, Mr. Carter. "He won't. I'll make sure he doesn't have to worry," Clara said softly. And somehow, her calm made it believable. Within hours, a memo circulated: temporary assignment. Assistant Clara Reeves. When Ethan's door opened later that day, he barely looked up. "Marjorie, I'll need the Zurich contracts printed and checked by..." He stopped mid-sentence. A different voice answered, I already reviewed them, sir. The formatting was inconsistent on page 7, so I corrected it. He glanced up. The woman standing before him wasn't the one he expected. She wore a navy blouse, simple, pressed, a notebook in her hands. Her expression was composed, but her eyes soft brown, steady held a quiet confidence that unsettled him. "You're Clara?" he asked. "Yes. Mr. Carter. I'll be assisting you on the Zurich trip. Marjorie had a family emergency." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded. "All right. Be at the hangar at 6 sharp. I'll be there at 5:30, she replied. He almost smiled but didn't. That night, as the city lights shimmered over the lake, Clara packed a single suitcase in her small apartment on the west side. She folded everything neatly, 2 blouses, 1 suit, a book her mother loved, on the counter. A small bottle of heart medication waited beside a handwritten note call before takeoff. Her mother's voice came through the line, thin but cheerful. "So, you're flying with the famous Ethan Carter. Don't forget to breathe, sweetheart." "I'll breathe. Mom, you always say that when you're scared." Clara smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'll be breathing a lot." The next morning, the private jet gleamed silver under a soft sunrise. Crew members moved quickly, loading files, laptops, the weight of billion-dollar negotiations. Ethan arrived exactly on time, suit immaculate, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. Clara stood at the base of the steps, holding a tablet and a small binder. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." He gave a brief nod, stepping past her onto the plane. But when she followed, she noticed something unexpected. His briefcase sat unopened beside him. He was staring out the window, his reflection caught between clouds and city skyline. "Would you like coffee?" she asked quietly. "No. Tea? Jasmine? If they have it." "They do." He looked at her, surprised. "You checked I read your travel notes," she said simply. "You prefer tea before long flights. Coffee makes you restless." For the first time that morning, his posture eased. "Efficient," he murmured. As the plane ascended through gray clouds, the city disappeared below. Clara settled across the aisle, reviewing schedules, confirming appointments, sending polite emails in 3 languages. Ethan watched her for a while, noticing how her hands moved precise, calm, as if she carried silence with her. Halfway through the flight, turbulence rippled through the cabin. Papers slid from his desk. Without thinking, Clara reached out, steadying the stack with one hand while the other braced the coffee tray. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second brief. Accidental. But it lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," he said, voice lower now. She nodded, returning to her seat. For a while, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the quiet clicking of laptop keys. Later, as the plane leveled, Ethan opened his notebook, but his mind kept circling back to the small interaction. He'd met hundreds of assistants polished, ambitious, eager to impress, but Clara wasn't any of those things. She didn't push for attention. She didn't fill the silence. She just existed comfortably within it. He found himself asking, "How long have you worked with us?" 2 months. Why Carter Innovations? She looked up, because what you're building renewable energy, clean systems, it matters. "I like being somewhere that tries to do good." Most people told him they joined for opportunity, for prestige, for the name. Her answer landed differently. "Real?" He turned back to the window. "You believe one company can change the world. I believe one person can start to," she said. For a moment, the steady rhythm of the engines seemed to fade. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Something in her voice so certain, yet gentle, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Hours later, Zurich unfolded beneath them like a painting snow-tipped rooftops, ribbons of light along the lake. The jet touched down softly. Ethan gathered his things, ready for the line of cars waiting on the tarmac. As he stepped out, a gust of cold wind swept across his face. Clara followed, clutching her folder, her hair catching the light. He turned slightly, watching her for just a second before speaking. "Welcome to Switzerland, Miss Reeves." She smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." The way she said his name, it wasn't deferential or rehearsed. It was steady, grounded, human. As they walked toward the waiting car, snowflakes began to drift again, slow and soundless. And though neither said it aloud, both of them felt something shift, a thread drawn quietly between two lives that, until that morning, had never touched. Ethan didn't yet know that this calm, unassuming woman would soon become the one voice strong enough to echo through the walls of his golden cage. The car door closed, muffling the wind. Zurich awaited, and somewhere between duty and destiny, the story truly began. The hum of the jet filled the silence like a heartbeat steady, constant, impossible to ignore. Outside the window, the night stretched endless and dark, the curve of the earth faint beneath the stars. Inside, the cabin lights were dim, soft gold spilling over polished wood and silver trays. 10 hours to Zurich, 10 hours between sky and silence. Ethan had tried to work. He'd opened his laptop twice, read the same line 3 times, and still couldn't remember a single word. Across the aisle, Clara sat quietly with her headset on, reviewing presentation slides. Her focus was calm, unforced. Every so often, she'd pause to jot something in her notebook with neat, looping handwriting. He didn't know why he noticed, only that he did. After a while, he broke the silence. "Do you always work this late?" Clara looked up, removing one earbud. "When the job calls for it." Her tone was light, not defensive. "Besides, it keeps me from thinking too much." He studied her face for a moment. "About what?" Her smile flickered, small but real. "About my mom." She hesitated, then added softly, "She's been in and out of the hospital this year. Heart complications. Some days are better than others." Ethan leaned back, the leather seat creaking quietly. "That's tough." It was the kind of thing people said when they didn't know what else to say. But he meant it. Clara nodded. "It is. But I'm lucky she's strong. She raised me on her own, worked 2 jobs, and somehow still made sure I believed life was beautiful. Even when it wasn't. For a moment, the plane seemed to still. No hum, no movement. Just the space between 2 people who rarely spoke about real things." Ethan's voice was low. "Does she know you're on this trip?" "She does." Clara smiled again, this time with warmth. She said, "Don't forget to look out the window. People forget they're flying." He exhaled through his nose, a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Sounds like she's wiser than most executives I know." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Maybe wisdom comes easier when you've lost things and survived." Her words landed softly, but they stayed. He looked out at the horizon, the faint line where sky met nothing. For someone who controlled everything, he suddenly felt how small control really was. After a pause, she asked, "What about you, Mr. Carter? Do you ever stop working?" He glanced at her, then back to the screen still glowing in front of him. "Not really, not even for dinner. Family work is simpler." Clara nodded, thoughtful. "Simple doesn't always mean peaceful." Ethan looked at her again, this time longer. She wasn't challenging him. She was just stating something true. And somehow, truth sounded different in her voice, gentler, easier to hear. He asked quietly, "Do you ever get tired of understanding people?" "Understanding?" He shrugged. "You seem like someone who does, who listens more than she talks." Her eyes softened. "I think understanding people isn't about knowing everything about them. It's about not needing to." She paused, letting the thought settle before adding, "My mom used to say, try to understand people so you can connect, not control." Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Connect, not control," he repeated. The words rolled off his tongue like something foreign. In his world, Everything depended on control markets, mergers, media, even emotions. But connection. That was a language he'd forgotten. The engines hummed again. Clara closed her laptop, sensing he needed the silence more than conversation. For a few minutes, they both just sat there, two souls suspended somewhere above the clouds, each carrying a weight the other couldn't see. When the flight attendant brought tea, Clara reached out instinctively to steady the cup before it tipped. Their hands brushed again, the same accidental touch as before, but this time neither pulled away too quickly. Ethan looked at her fingers, small, graceful, a faint ink smudge near the thumb, signs of someone who worked hard and didn't hide it. He cleared his throat. How long have you been caring for her? Your mother, since I was 19. She had her first surgery that year. Clara spoke softly, eyes fixed on the cup in her hands. At first, I thought if I could just make enough money, fix enough things, she'd get better. But life doesn't work like business. You can't always fix it. Ethan nodded slowly. No, you can't. She glanced at him, then really looked. You sound like you've learned that, too. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the sky shifted from black to a soft gray blue. Dawn was beginning somewhere far below them. Light touched the clouds like watercolor, thin, fleeting. Almost sacred, Clara whispered. Look. Ethan turned. For a long time, neither spoke. The sunrise burned quietly against the curve of the wing, painting the clouds in gold and blush tones. It's strange, Clara said at last. How peaceful everything looks from up here. You'd never guess what's happening on the ground. Maybe that's why people chase the sky. Ethan murmured. She smiled. Or maybe they're just looking for perspective. Something in her tone made him feel seen, not as the CEO, not as the man with headlines and expectations, but as someone still figuring out how to breathe. He sat back, watching the light grow stronger. Somewhere inside, a small crack opened in the armor he'd built for years. It didn't hurt. It just felt honest. Hours later, when the captain announced their descent into Zurich, Ethan realized they'd been talking, or sometimes just sharing silence for almost half the flight. Time had blurred, not from distraction, but from something else. Ease. He gathered his files, his expression composed again, but his mind still tracing the echo of her words. Connect, not control. As the wheels touched the runway, Clara glanced out the window and said quietly, "We made it." He turned toward her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. We did. It was a simple exchange, yet it felt like the beginning of something neither of them could name. Outside, the morning light of Switzerland shimmered across the wet tarmac. The engine slowed, the cabin filled with the soft rustle of people preparing to move again. And Ethan Carter, a man who once measured life in meetings and minutes, realized he was reluctant for this moment to end. For the first time in years, the journey had felt longer than the destination, and that, somehow, felt like the point. Morning unfolded over Zurich like a slow breath. Mist curled above the lake, and the first sunlight brushed against the snow-covered rooftops. From the balcony of the Dolder Grand, Ethan stood quietly, a cup of black coffee in hand, watching the city wake beneath him. Bells from a distant church chimed through the crisp air. Somewhere below, a tram glided past like a silver thread between cobblestone streets. Everything was calm, precise, almost too perfect, like a painting that dared him to find something human inside it. Behind him, there was a gentle knock on the door. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Clara's voice carried softly through the space. She stepped inside, holding a folder and her ever-present notebook. Her hair was still damp from the morning shower, a few loose strands escaping as she adjusted her scarf. "Breakfast is ready downstairs, and the meeting with the Swiss partners has been moved up to 10. Ethan turned slightly, studying her composure. Even jet lag hadn't touched her. 10? Yes, their director, Mr. Vogel, prefers early discussions. I called the coordinator last night to confirm. He raised an eyebrow. Last night I didn't assign that. I know, she said, smiling lightly. But I thought you'd want a full day before the gala tonight. Fewer surprises. Ethan let out a low breath that sounded halfway between approval and disbelief. You don't like surprises, do you? Only the good kind, she replied, setting her folder on the table. Then, almost as an afterthought, she placed a small ceramic dish beside his cup. Hazelnut biscotti. From the bakery downstairs. I read that you like them with your coffee. He blinked, looking from the dish to her. You read that in an interview you gave 4 years ago, she said simply. The article was about leadership, but you mentioned biscotti when they asked how you start your mornings. For a long second, he didn't answer. He just watched her, this young woman who noticed details no one else remembered. The kind of details that made a life feel less like a routine and more like a memory. He sat down, breaking a piece of biscotti in half. You're thorough, Miss Reeves. I try to be. The room fell quiet again, except for the faint sound of the lake below. Ethan took a sip of his coffee, and for once, it tasted right warm, balanced, not too bitter. He wondered if she knew that, too. Later that morning, the meeting room at Vogel Energy was lined with glass, overlooking Zurich's financial district. Executives in tailored suits greeted Ethan with the firm handshakes and practiced smiles that filled most of his days. Clara stood to the side, tablet in hand, observing everything without intruding. When the lead negotiator began speaking in German, Ethan leaned forward, nodding politely. He spoke enough to follow, but Clara stepped in smoothly, translating with soft precision. Her accent was clean, unforced. She added small clarifications, bridging not only language but tone. The room seemed to ease. Conversations flowed. Laughter even surfaced once or twice. At one point, Mr. Vogel gestured toward Ethan and said something that made the table chuckle. Ethan glanced at Clara, uncertain. She leaned closer and whispered, He said he admires your commitment but warns that Swiss punctuality might test your American optimism. Ethan smiled for the first time that morning. Tell him I'll try to be more Swiss. Then, she translated with ease, her voice carrying warmth that turned the room lighter. When the meeting ended, contracts were signed faster than expected. Vogel clasped Ethan's shoulder, saying, You have an excellent assistant. She understands more than words. Ethan nodded, eyes flicking briefly toward Clara. Yes, he said quietly. She does. Outside, the air was crisp and bright. Clara walked beside him down the marble steps of the building. That went well, she said. It did. He agreed. You managed to make half a dozen men smile before 10 in the morning. That's a miracle. Not a miracle. She laughed softly. Just listening. He glanced sideways at her. You think that's enough to make business work. Sometimes it's the only thing that does. The car ride back to the hotel was quiet. Ethan watched the reflection of the city slide across the window bridges, trams, the shimmer of sunlight over the lake. Clara's phone buzzed once, but she silenced it quickly. Her expression changed for just a second, something tight, fleeting, but then it was gone. He didn't ask. Not yet. When they reached the hotel, she excused herself to review the gala notes. Ethan lingered in the lobby, pretending to check messages, but his eyes followed her as she disappeared into the elevator, the soft sound of her heels fading away. Upstairs, his suite looked the same, polished, orderly, untouched. He walked to the balcony again, looking out over the water. The morning had already deepened into gold. Below, he saw Clara on the terrace, speaking with one of the hotel staff, her gestures graceful, her laughter brief but genuine. Even from that distance, she seemed to belong to the light, to the moment, to the world itself. Something stirred inside him, faint but persistent. A recognition, like hearing a melody he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. It was ridiculous. She was his assistant. This was work. But the thought refused to leave. She made everything around her feel alive. When noon came, Clara knocked gently on his door again. "Lunch will be served on the terrace, sir. I've arranged for local dishes, nothing heavy before tonight's event." He looked up from his laptop. "You seem to have everything planned. Just enough to keep the day steady," she said, smiling. He hesitated, then asked quietly, "How long have you lived like that, keeping things steady?" The question surprised even him. Clara paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Since I was old enough to know life doesn't stay that way," she said. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No titles, no roles, just two people suspended in the stillness of a hotel room, far from home. The sound of the church bells rose again in the distance, marking the hour. Clara straightened gently. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." As the door closed behind her, Ethan stood still, listening to the echo fade. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and coffee. Outside, the lake shimmered like a sheet of silver glass, sunlight gliding across its surface. And somewhere between the steady rhythm of work and the quiet grace of that morning, Ethan Carter began to realize he didn't just admire her efficiency. He admired the way she brought warmth into every cold room she entered. That afternoon, Zurich glowed brighter than usual. But for Ethan, the light had already changed. The chandeliers glittered like stars caught in crystal. Every surface in the grand ballroom reflected light glass, gold, polished marble, the kind of place designed to impress, where every laugh sounded a little rehearsed and every smile hid a calculation. But tonight, for the first time, Ethan Carter wasn't the most interesting person in the room. He noticed her the moment she entered. Clara moved through the crowd with quiet grace, her navy dress simple but elegant, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. No jewels, no sparkle, just a calm presence that somehow drew every light toward her. She wasn't trying to stand out. She simply did. Ethan stood near the bar, tie perfectly in place, glass in hand. Around him, diplomats and executives exchanged compliments that meant nothing. His assistant had handled everything: the seating, the introductions, even the subtle shift in music tempo to align with the Swiss host's schedule. He'd expected competence. He hadn't expected this. When the ambassador approached, Clara was already there, greeting him in fluent German. Her tone was respectful, but not stiff. She laughed softly at his comment about American punctuality, then gestured toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter might be American," she said with a teasing lilt, "but he's learning Swiss precision faster than most of us learn patience." The group chuckled, their faces easing. Ethan felt something unusual: pride, maybe mixed with surprise. The people around him weren't just engaging with him because of his name anymore. They were listening, smiling, opening up, and it was Clara's doing. When she turned to translate a question for him, her eyes met his briefly. For a second, the noise of the room dimmed. There was no ballroom, no company, no expectations, just the quiet steadiness of her gaze. Then she looked away, and the sound returned, the spell dissolving into the rhythm of conversation. Later, as the night deepened, Ethan found himself surrounded by Europe's elite, the heads of energy firms, government ministers, media sponsors. Clara stood slightly behind him, as any assistant would, but somehow her presence anchored him. Whenever he hesitated, she was there with a quiet word, a subtle reminder, a calm translation that turned tension into understanding. At one point, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes, Mr. Reinhardt, a German industrialist, raised his glass to Ethan. "You are lucky, Mr. Carter," he said with a knowing smile. "Few men are wise enough to stand beside someone who makes them better." Ethan blinked. Better Reinhardt nodded toward Clara. "When a person helps you become a better version of yourself, don't let them go. The world has enough people who take. Cherish the ones who add." Ethan's throat tightened before he could answer. Reinhardt turned away to greet another guest, leaving Ethan standing still, his reflection caught in the golden rim of his glass. Clara noticed his silence. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Just thinking." About what he hesitated, what it means to become better. Her smile was gentle. Sometimes it just means remembering who you were before the noise. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that held too many things unsaid. You really believe that I have to, she said simply. Otherwise, life would only be about survival. The band began to play something slower, a waltz, elegant and timeless. Couples drifted toward the dance floor, the soft sweep of gowns and polished shoes gliding under the chandeliers. Clara started to step back, giving him space, but he turned slightly toward her. Do you dance? Miss Reeves. Her eyes widened just a fraction. Only when no one's watching. Then pretend no one is. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. A quiet one, for a heartbeat. She hesitated. Then she placed her hand in his. Her palm was warm, her touch unsure but honest. They moved slowly onto the edge of the floor. Ethan's hand rested lightly on her back, careful, respectful. But his heartbeat felt louder than the music. They moved without speaking. The world around them blurred into color and light. She was smaller than he'd imagined, but strong, guiding herself with effortless grace. Every turn, every pause seemed to say something words couldn't hold. When the song ended, they stepped apart, a little too slowly. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above the music. For what? For remembering that even CEOs are allowed to be human. He almost smiled. It's been a while. She laughed softly, then excused herself to greet a representative arriving late. Ethan watched her walk away, her silhouette weaving between the glittering crowd, and realized the strangest thing: he wasn't thinking about contracts or headlines or strategy. He was thinking about her laugh, about how she'd made him forget the performance of power for one quiet dance. Hours later, long after the last guests had left and the ballroom had grown still, Ethan returned to his suite. The city outside was hushed, the lake gleaming faintly under the moonlight. He loosened his tie, poured a glass of water, and sat by the window. Reinhardt's words echoed in his mind. When a person helps you become a better version of yourself, don't let them go. He thought about Clara's voice, her quiet confidence, her unguarded kindness, about the way she listened not to respond, but to understand. For years, Ethan had built walls so high no one could reach him. But tonight, a single conversation, a single look had made a small crack appear. He leaned his head back against the chair, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come easily. Not tonight. Outside, Zurich slept under a sky full of stars. Inside, one man sat awake, wondering if the moment that had just passed was simply coincidence, or the beginning of something that would change everything. The last thing he remembered before dawn began to rise was the sound of her laughter echoing softly in his mind. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, deliberate flakes drifting through the cold Zurich night. The city below the Dolder Grand was hushed, lights glowing faintly through the mist like lanterns underwater. From the balcony, the world looked almost still, almost safe. Ethan stood there in his shirt sleeves, the air crisp against his skin. The gala had ended hours ago, but his mind hadn't settled. Too many faces, too many voices, too many thoughts circling back to one. Behind him, there was a soft knock on the open door. Clara stepped out quietly, her coat pulled close around her. "You're still awake," she said. He didn't turn, couldn't sleep. "I couldn't either," she admitted, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She joined him by the railing, a careful distance between them. The city stretched below like a memory neither of them quite belonged to. For a while, they didn't speak. The snow fell thicker, whispering against the stone balustrade, somewhere far below. A clock tower chimed midnight. Ethan broke the silence first. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low, "how we can be surrounded by people all day and still feel completely alone?" Clara looked at him. "All the time." He nodded slightly, eyes on the lake shimmering faintly through the fog. I think that's the hardest part of success. Everyone wants something from you. Your time, your image, your approval. You give pieces of yourself away until there's nothing left to give. Her tone softened. And then they call you cold when you stop giving. He turned toward her. Surprised? Exactly. I get it, she said quietly. Different world, same feeling. The wind brushed her hair across her cheek. Without thinking, Ethan reached out, fingers hovering for a moment before gently tucking the strand behind her ear. It was a simple gesture, instinctive, but when his fingertips brushed her skin, everything stilled, neither moved. For a heartbeat, the noise of the world disappeared, the hum of traffic, the ticking clock, even the wind. There was only the soft rhythm of breath, the faint warmth of touch in the middle of the cold. Ethan's hand lingered for a second too long before he pulled it back, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. She shook her head. Don't be... Silence again. But this one wasn't uncomfortable. It was fragile, like glass that could break with one wrong word. Clara leaned her arms against the railing. When I was younger, she began, I used to think success meant never struggling again, that if I just worked hard enough, life would stop hurting. She smiled faintly. Turns out, pain just changes shape. Ethan's eyes stayed on her profile, the curve of her face lit by the faint reflection of the city lights. You sound like someone who's lived more than her age. Maybe, she said. Or maybe I just pay attention. He studied her for a long moment. There was no pretense in her, no mask to decode, just quiet honesty, something rare in the world he lived in, something he'd almost forgotten existed. I envy that, he said finally. What your ability to still believe in people, to see good in things. Clara's breath came out slow, visible in the air. I don't always, but I try. It's easier to carry light than bitterness. Her words sank into the silence between them. Ethan thought about his life, the boardrooms, the cameras, the empty penthouse waiting back in Chicago. All the noise he'd built to avoid the quiet truth. He didn't know who he was without it. When he spoke again, his voice cracked slightly. I don't know when I stopped feeling real. Clara turned to face him. Maybe it's not about feeling real. Maybe it's about remembering what matters. He exhaled, a slow, uneven breath. And what if I've forgotten how she looked at him? Eyes steady, then start small. He met her gaze, searching for something to say. But there were no words big enough for the weight in his chest, only the quiet ache of being seen. The snow kept falling, catching in her hair, turning her brown strands to silver under the light. Ethan reached out again, almost without meaning to, brushing a few flakes away. This time, she didn't move. Her eyes met his, soft but unflinching. For a long second, they stood there, breathing the same cold air, hearts beating somewhere in the fragile space between restraint and longing. He could feel it, the line they'd drawn, the one they were both standing too close to. It shimmered between them, thin and dangerous, but neither stepped back. Finally, Clara whispered, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow. He nodded, but his voice came out low. Clara. She looked up. Thank you. For tonight. For reminding me I'm still human. She smiled, small and real. You always were. Ethan, you just forgot the sound of your own heartbeat. The words hit something deep inside him, something that had been waiting, quietly, for years. She turned toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced back once more, her eyes meeting his under the falling snow. Good night, she said softly. He didn't answer until she was gone. Good night, he whispered to the empty balcony. The wind carried the word away, dissolving into the hush of snow. Ethan stood there a moment longer, his hands still tingling from where he'd touched her. Inside, the city slept. Outside, the night went on white, endless and silent, and somewhere, in that silence, something inside him shifted small, quiet, but irreversible. He stayed there until dawn began to touch the horizon, wondering if a single moment of honesty could change everything that came after. The morning after the gala came cold and white. Zurich was wrapped in snow. Rooftops softened under a quiet sky. From the window of his suite, Ethan watched the flakes drift down in slow, unhurried spirals. The city looked peaceful, perfect, but inside, he felt restless. The schedule for the day sat open on the table beside him, a press luncheon, a board reception, another formal dinner with sponsors. All the same polished smiles, all the same words that meant nothing. He closed the folder and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the calendar for a moment before he pressed delete. The dinner was canceled, without explanation, without hesitation. It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. When Clara knocked at his door later that afternoon, she was carrying a tablet and a stack of revised documents. Her hair was still damp from the snow outside. Mr. Carter, the car for the gala. "We're not going," he said simply. She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Excuse me." He looked up, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "Change of plans? How do you feel about a drive?" Her confusion softened into curiosity. A drive? Where? He stood, buttoning his coat. South. Lauterbrunnen Valley. "I've been told it's beautiful this time of year." There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by something gentler trust. "It's a few hours away," she said. "Good," he replied. "I could use a few hours away." The drive took them out of the city and into the whispering silence of the Swiss countryside. Snow clung to the edges of pine trees. Small cottages smoked faintly in the distance, their chimneys thin and crooked against the white hills. The road wound upward, the world narrowing into curves and clouds. Clara sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. For a while, neither spoke. The car heater hummed softly, filling the silence with warmth. She finally broke it. "You don't do this often, do you? What, disappear from your own schedule?" He smiled faintly. "Never." "Then why now?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Because last night felt like a performance, and I'm tired of playing the part." Her voice softened. "And what part is that? The man who never needs a break, the one who always knows where he's going." Clara looked out the window. The snow was heavier now, blanketing the world in silence. "Maybe you just needed to forget who you're supposed to be," she said. He glanced at her. "And who should I be instead?" She smiled. "Maybe just Ethan?" He didn't answer, but something in his chest eased. When they reached Lauterbrunnen, the valley unfolded before them, wide and still, wrapped in white. The cliffs rose steeply on either side, frozen waterfalls hanging like glass ribbons against the stone. Wooden chalets dotted the slopes, smoke curling from their roofs. The world felt untouched, honest. They parked near a small bridge, snow crunching beneath their boots as they stepped out. The air was thin and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Clara pulled her scarf higher around her neck. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "It's quiet." That too. They walked slowly along the trail beside the river. Their footsteps left two clean lines in the snow, side by side but not touching. Clara's cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath white in the air. Ethan found himself watching her, not in the way a man watches beauty, but in the way someone notices life and wonders when he stopped feeling part of it. "After a while," Clara said softly, "when I was little, my mom and I used to come to places like this. She said mountains remind you how small you are, but in a good way. Like the world doesn't need you to be perfect, just present." Ethan looked at her. "You miss her?" She nodded. "Every day. Even when she's still here, I miss her." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's the fear, I think. Watching her fade a little more each year and not being able to stop it. I work, I plan, I save, but none of it feels like enough." He stopped walking. "Clara." She turned, and he saw the exhaustion behind her, calm the quiet grief she never showed. "You've done more than enough," he said softly. "You carry so much, and still, you smile. Still, you find light in things most people walk past." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Sometimes I'm just pretending to be strong." Ethan stepped closer. "Pretending still takes strength." The words hung there, warm against the cold. She looked up at him, eyes shining with a mix of pain and gratitude. The wind moved through the valley, carrying only the sound of the river below. He didn't think, he just reached out, his hand brushing hers. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't an accident either. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't pull away. Their hands stayed like that, barely touching, yet connected long enough for the world to fall silent again. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Ethan?" He met her eyes. "You're strong enough, Clara, for all of it." Something in her broke, not in a way that shattered, but in a way that opened. She closed her eyes, breathing in the moment, as if letting his words steady her heartbeat. They stood there for what felt like forever, two people surrounded by snow and sky, neither sure where this would lead, only that something real had begun to move between them. When the first stars appeared, Ethan led her back toward the car. They didn't speak during the drive. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things neither dared to say. Back at the hotel, he walked her to her room. At the door, she turned to him, her expression soft. "Thank you for today." He nodded. It wasn't in the plan. She smiled faintly. Maybe the best things never are. He watched her disappear behind the door. Then he stood there for a moment longer, the echo of her words lingering in the hall. Outside, the snow kept falling slow, endless, forgiving. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan Carter knew that his carefully built world had just begun to shift again. One heartbeat at a time, the snow started falling before sunset, small flakes at first, soft and harmless. But by nightfall, the wind had risen into a low, restless howl that pressed against the windows of the Dolder Grand. The city beyond disappeared behind a wall of white. Zurich had gone still. Flights canceled, roads closed, every plan frozen. Inside the hotel, the world felt quieter than usual. The corridors were empty. The fire in the lounge burned low, and the air smelled faintly of old books and cedar. Ethan stood by the window of the library, watching the snow swirl under the lamplight outside. He'd spent the last hour trying to focus on reports, on schedules, on anything that would pull him back into the order of his life. But the paper stayed blank. Behind him, footsteps, light, familiar. Clara appeared in the doorway, her sweater the color of cream, her hair loose around her shoulders. "The front desk says the storm won't ease until morning," she said. "We're officially snowed in." Ethan turned, a small smile ghosting across his face. "Then I guess Zurich has decided to hold us hostage." "Could be worse," she said, stepping inside. "At least the library's warm." She crossed the room, running her hand gently over the spines of the books. Old bindings, faded titles in German, French, Latin. She stopped at one shelf and tilted her head. "Do you ever read things that don't teach you how to win?" He raised an eyebrow. "You mean fiction stories," she said softly. "The kind that remind you how to feel." He looked down at the volume in his hand. The Art of Corporate Leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. He set it aside. Maybe it's been too long. Clara smiled and pulled a worn book from the shelf. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "Rilke, German poetry. My mom used to read this when she couldn't sleep." Ethan took it, the cover smooth with age. "You speak German fluently." "Not perfectly," she said, "but enough to understand what matters." He opened the book, the pages whispering as he turned them. His voice was quiet when he began to read, the syllables careful but clear. The words filled the room with a rhythm older than either of them. Clara listened, her eyes soft. When he finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty. That was beautiful, she said. I didn't understand half of it. You don't have to, she replied. Some things are meant to be felt, not solved. The fire crackled in the corner, outside. The wind moaned softly against the glass. Time seemed to slow. Ethan set the book down and leaned back in his chair. You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't doing this? Clara looked thoughtful. You mean work everything? She smiled faintly. Sometimes I dream about opening a little cafe. Nothing fancy, just a place where people come to breathe for a while. He watched her as she spoke, the way her hands moved slightly when she talked, the light that crept into her eyes when she mentioned something she loved. Why don't you, he asked. She hesitated. Because dreams cost money, and right now, every dollar I have belongs to my mom's next doctor visit. The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. No self-pity, just truth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You deserve more than just surviving. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. Maybe, but surviving means she's still here, and that's enough for me. He felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of admiration and ache. You make it sound easy. It's not, she said simply. The storm outside grew louder, wind pressing harder against the windows. The fire flickered lower, painting their faces in shades of amber. Ethan watched the light move across her features, the way it softened her expression, made her look at once fragile and strong. Without thinking, he said quietly, You know, I can't remember the last time I saw someone smile and actually meant it. Except you. Clara blinked, surprised. What do you mean I mean? He said slowly. You don't smile because it's polite, or because someone expects it. You smile like it's the one thing you still own. She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the armrest. Maybe it's the only thing I can give that doesn't cost anything. He shook his head. You're wrong. It costs you. Her eyes met his again, searching. And why does that matter to you? Ethan hesitated. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things that couldn't be spoken easily. When he finally answered, his voice was soft but steady. Because I don't want you to lose it. I don't want the world or me to take that from you. For a moment, neither breathed. The fire snapped quietly. The snow thickened against the windows. Clara looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, he stood, the distance between them closing without thought. You make this place feel alive again, he said. And I don't know what to do with that. Her breath caught. You don't have to do anything. He smiled, faintly. That's the problem. I want to. The space between them thinned until it was nothing but breath. Then, as if afraid of what might happen next, Ethan stepped back. We should get some rest, he murmured. Clara nodded, her eyes still fixed on him. Yeah. We should. She turned toward the door, but before she reached it, he said quietly, Clara. She looked back. Thank you for reminding me what real feels like. Her expression softened. You didn't forget. You just stopped believing it was still out there. And then she was gone, leaving him standing in the half-lit room, the fire low and the world outside still storming. Ethan walked back to the window. Snow pressed thick against the glass, blurring the city beyond. He could see his reflection faintly in the pain-tired eyes, loosened tie, something unguarded in his face. He reached out, fingertips brushing the cold surface. Somewhere between the warmth of the fire and the chill of the storm, he realized he wasn't cold anymore. The night stretched long and quiet, the kind that held its breath between one life and the next. The storm hadn't stopped. It had only deepened. Snow piled thick along the windowsills of the Dolder Grand, muffling every sound. By midnight, the hotel was half asleep, lights dimmed, corridors empty. The fireplace in the library had burned low to embers. Ethan sat alone near it, the quiet pressing in like a weight. He should have been resting. Tomorrow meant renegotiations, press follow-ups, another day of being Ethan Carter, CEO, but his mind wouldn't settle, not after that night in the storm, not after the way Clara had looked at him before walking away. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, he didn't know what tomorrow looked like, and strangely, he didn't mind. He was still lost in that thought when the silence broke. A sharp, trembling knock at the door. He was already on his feet when he heard her voice. "Ethan," he opened it quickly. Clara stood there in her coat, phone in hand, eyes wide with panic. She looked like she couldn't catch her breath. "My mom," she whispered. "She's in the hospital. Cardiac arrest. They don't know if her voice cracked." "I need to get home." The words hit like a strike of cold air. He didn't hesitate. "Okay, we'll leave now." She shook her head, tears blurring her eyes. "The airport's there closed. I just called. The storm grounded every flight out of Zurich until morning." "I can't." She pressed her palms to her face. "I can't just sit here. Ethan." He moved closer, his voice calm but firm. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," she said, her breath catching. "They said, there's always a way," he interrupted softly. She looked up at him then, desperate, eyes pleading like someone reaching for a lifeline in the dark. "Please, I can't lose her." Ethan felt something shift inside him, somewhere deep, where logic stopped and instinct took over. "Get your things," he said, "now." "Ethan, go," he said gently, his tone leaving no room for argument. She stared at him for a moment, then nodded and turned down the hall. By the time she returned 10 minutes later, the suite looked different. His laptop was open, the phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but resolute. "Yes, clearance within the hour. I'll cover whatever it costs. Weather exemptions, fuel routing, everything." He paused, listening. "Good. Make it happen." When he hung up, she was standing there, her small suitcase by her side. "What did you do?" He reached for his coat. "The company has a helicopter in Bern. It's prepped for executive emergencies. I told them this qualifies." Her brow furrowed. "Ethan, that's impossible. The storm. They'll navigate through the valleys and connect to a private jet out of Lyon once the sky clears enough. It's risky, but it'll get you home." She stared at him as if trying to understand. Why would you do that for me?" He met her eyes, because when someone you care about is in pain, you don't stand still. The words hung there, soft but heavy. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them carried everything they hadn't said, the fear, the tenderness, the unspoken truth neither dared to name. "Finally," she whispered. "Thank you." He nodded. "Let's go." The hallway was dark and silent as they moved through it. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, whipping snow against the glass doors. The hotel staff watched in disbelief as Ethan Carter, one of the most private men in business, walked through the lobby at 1 a.m, coat collar up, hand steady on the shoulder of his assistant. The car waited out front, engine humming low. The driver, a burly man with frost on his beard, looked at Ethan through the snow. "You're sure about this?" "Sir, the roads aren't safe." "I'm not asking if they're safe," Ethan said. "I'm asking if they're possible." The man nodded once and opened the door. Clara hesitated before climbing in. As the car cut through the storm, the city lights vanished behind them. The road twisted along the frozen river, headlights bouncing off walls of snow. Clara sat quietly beside him, fingers clenched around her phone. Every few minutes, she'd glance down, as if hoping for a message from a world far away. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye. Her face was pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. She looked small, fragile, and yet there was something fierce about the way she kept breathing through the fear. At one point, he said quietly, "She's strong. You told me that." Clara nodded, eyes fixed on the storm outside. "She is. I just don't know if strength is enough this time." He reached out, hesitated, then placed his hand gently over hers. It was a simple touch, steady, grounding. "You are?" She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Ethan?" The car hit a patch of rough ice, jolting slightly, but neither moved. They just sat there, the noise of the storm fading beneath the quiet pulse of the moment. By the time they reached the helipad, dawn was just beginning to color the sky. The snow had thinned into flurries, light and slow. The helicopter stood waiting, blades turning lazily, a streak of red and white against the gray morning. Ethan stepped out first, snow crunching under his boots. He turned back, holding out a hand for her. She took it. When she reached the door, she stopped. "You're not coming." He shook his head. "You'll make better time without me." Her eyes searched his. "What if something goes wrong?" He smiled faintly. "Then I'll fix it." She wanted to say more, but couldn't. The lump in her throat made words impossible. As she climbed aboard, she looked down at him, this man who had spent his life controlling everything, now standing in a storm for someone who had taught him how to feel again. He met her gaze and said softly, "Go. Be with her." The pilot gave the signal, and the helicopter began to lift, wind-whipping snow into a white blur. Clara's heart pounded as the ground dropped away. Through the glass, she could still see Ethan's coat flapping, head tilted up, the faintest smile in his eyes. She pressed a hand to the window, whispering something he couldn't hear. When the helicopter disappeared into the clouds, Ethan stood there for a long while, snow melting into his hair, breath curling in the air. He didn't move until the last echo of the blades faded into silence. Then he looked toward the horizon, where night was breaking into morning, and whispered to no one, "Come back safe." The wind answered softly, carrying her name through the cold. The helicopter cut through the clouds like a quiet heartbeat in the dark. The storm had thinned to a whisper now, the snow below glowing faintly in the moonlight. Inside the cabin, everything felt suspended, neither earth nor sky, just air and sound and breath. Clara sat by the window, her face pale in the soft light of the dashboard. Below them, the Swiss Alps stretched endlessly white, still, and far too calm for what was happening inside her. Her phone lay in her lap, the screen dark. The last message from the hospital said only 2 words: "Still critical." Ethan sat across from her, his eyes fixed on her profile. He'd been silent for most of the flight, giving her space to fall apart if she needed to. But she hadn't. She sat straight, her hands clenched tight, as if holding herself together was the only thing keeping the world from breaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You should try to rest." She shook her head. "I can't. Not until I know." He nodded, understanding too well what helplessness felt like. The hum of the rotors filled the silence between them. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time felt strange up here, weightless. Clara turned her face toward the window. The reflection of the moonlight traced the curve of her cheek. She looked tired, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with perfection. Ethan's chest tightened. For days, he'd been fighting something he couldn't name, but now, in the quiet of this cabin, where the world had stripped down to just 2 people and a fragile hope, he couldn't fight it anymore. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said softly, "Clara." She turned, eyes weary but alert. "What is it?" He hesitated, the words heavy in his throat. "There's something I need to tell you." "Now?" she asked gently, as if she wasn't sure she could take one more thing. He nodded. "Now, because if I wait, I'll lose the courage." Her brow furrowed. "Ethan, I've spent my whole life choosing what's right for the company, for my image, for the version of myself people expect. But every decision felt like a trade, like I was giving away pieces of who I am." His voice was low, steady, and then you showed up. She blinked, unsure what he meant. "You reminded me what it means to care without calculation," he continued, "to listen without trying to fix, to see things that don't make sense and love them anyway." Her lips parted slightly. "Ethan," he looked straight at her, "I'm in love with you. Clara." The hum of the engine filled the pause that followed. Even the pilot's radio chatter seemed to fade away. Clara stared at him, stunned, as if the air itself had thinned. "You can't mean that." He smiled faintly, sad and certain all at once. I wish I didn't. It would be easier if I didn't. Her voice trembled. You're engaged, Ethan. You have a life waiting back in Chicago. I have an arrangement, he said quietly. A future built on expectations I no longer believe in. Clara looked away, her throat tightening. And me. What am I in that future? He didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, eyes still on her. You're the only part of it that feels real. She shook her head. Don't say that. Not now. Not while everything is falling apart. I'm saying it because everything is falling apart, he said. Because life doesn't wait until the timing is right. It just happens. And sometimes it breaks all the rules you've built. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. Do you even hear yourself? You're risking everything for a feeling that might not survive the ground. He looked at her for a long moment. Maybe. But I'd rather lose everything than pretend I don't feel it. The words hung in the air, raw and dangerous. Clara looked down at her hands, her breath unsteady. You don't know what you're asking me to feel. Ethan, you're my boss. I work for you. I depend on this job. My mother depends on it. And She stopped, shaking her head. I can't afford to feel anything for you. He leaned closer. Then don't. Just don't decide yet. Let's just be here. She closed her eyes, as if that might stop her heart from answering, but it didn't. Silence filled the cabin again. The engine droned softly, constant, like a heartbeat in the dark. Ethan sat back, eyes on the window now. You know, he said quietly, before you came, I used to think love was a distraction, something that weakens you. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. And now, he turned toward her. Now, I think it's the only thing that makes you strong enough to face who you really are. She didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to her lap, then to the small window beside her. Outside, the moonlight brushed over the curve of the mountains below. For a long time, they sat in silence, two people suspended between earth and sky, between duty and desire, between everything they were and everything they weren't supposed to be. Finally, Clara spoke. If you mean what you said, if you truly mean it, then this moment is both the best and the worst thing that's ever happened to me. He looked at her, his voice low. Then we're both ruined. She gave a small, broken laugh, half sob, half surrender. You shouldn't say that like it's a good thing. Maybe it is, he murmured. Maybe sometimes ruin is just the start of something honest. Her eyes met his then, and something in her gave way. Not agreement, not rejection, just quiet recognition. They didn't speak after that. There was nothing left to say. The words had already been spoken, and they couldn't be taken back. The helicopter flew on through the night, the sound of the rotors steady and low. Clara leaned her head against the glass, eyes closed, tears slipping silently down her cheek. Ethan watched her, the ache in his chest both unbearable and undeniable. The horizon began to lighten, a soft gray bleeding into the dark, and as the first edge of dawn touched the sky, he whispered, almost to himself, whatever happens next, at least I told the truth. The sound of the engine swallowed the rest. Only the sky bore witness to what had changed between them, quiet, infinite, and impossible to undo. Morning light spread across the skyline of Chicago, pale and quiet after a sleepless night. The private jet touched down just after dawn. The moment the wheels met the ground, Clara exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath the entire flight home. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was short, but it carried the weight of the world. She's stable. Just 2 words, but they were everything. Tears welled in Clara's eyes before she could stop them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trembling with relief. Ethan, sitting across from her, watched in silence. He didn't speak, didn't move, just let her feel. When she finally looked up, her voice broke. She's alive. He nodded softly. Good. That's all that matters. She wanted to say more, to thank him, but words failed. All she could do was meet his gaze quiet, raw, full of gratitude that reached deeper than anything she could express. They drove straight from the airport to the hospital. Snow was still falling over the city, though lighter now, melting into the slush of early morning traffic. The building rose gray against the winter sky, and for a second, Clara hesitated at the doors. "I don't know what I'll see," she whispered. Ethan placed a hand gently on her back. "Whatever it is, you won't see it alone." Inside, the world smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Machines hummed softly. Her mother lay in the bed, small, pale, but breathing. That sound, that rhythm, was enough. Clara pressed her forehead against her mother's hand and finally let go. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. From where he stood, he saw something he hadn't felt in years, peace that didn't come from control or success, but from love that refused to break. Hours passed. Doctors came and went. Clara stayed by her mother's side, her eyes red but steady. When she finally walked out to the hallway, Ethan was there still waiting, his coat folded over his arm. "She's sleeping now," Clara said softly. "Then so should you." She shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then at least let me take you home." But before she could answer, a voice broke through the quiet hallway, sharp, too loud for a hospital. "Ethan!" He froze. Clara turned. Vanessa Cole stood at the end of the corridor, tall, flawless, and furious. Her heels clicked against the tile with each step. She looked like a storm dressed in silk. "Vanessa," Ethan said, his tone calm but tired. "This isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time," she snapped. "You cancel our engagement dinner, disappear for a week. The press is calling my manager asking if we've split, and now I find you here, in a hospital, with your assistant." Clara's face flushed. She took a step back, but Ethan didn't move. His voice stayed level. "That's enough." Vanessa's laugh was cold. "Enough I gave you everything. Ethan, my name, my brand, my time. We were supposed to be the power couple everyone envied. And you throw it away for her." She turned toward Clara, eyes sharp. "What's your angle? Sweetheart sympathy. Did you think sleeping with the boss would get you a promotion?" Clara's breath caught, but before she could speak, Ethan stepped between them. His voice was low, firm, dangerous in its calm. Don't speak to her that way." Vanessa stared at him, stunned by the steel in his tone. "So it's true." He met her gaze without flinching. "It's over, Vanessa." The words hit the air like glass breaking. For a moment, she just stood there, eyes wide. Then her expression hardened. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you are. The perfect CEO who couldn't keep his hands off his assistant. Do whatever you need to," Ethan said quietly. "I'm done living for headlines." Vanessa's eyes glittered with fury. "You think the board will protect you when this goes public? When shareholders start asking questions about your judgment?" He didn't answer. He simply turned slightly, placing himself fully between her and Clara. "Go home, Vanessa. We're done here." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "You'll see how fast love turns into a scandal." And then she was gone, her perfume lingering like smoke. The hallway fell silent again. Clara stood frozen, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "Ethan?" He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his voice gentle. "I'm sorry you had to see that. You ended your engagement," she said softly. "For me, I ended something that should have ended a long time ago." He said, "For both of us." She shook her head slowly, tears rising again, but this time not from fear. "You don't have to protect me." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I just don't know how not to." They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking. The hospital lights buzzed softly overhead. Clara finally looked down, her hands trembling. "She's going to destroy you. The company. Everything you've worked for." Ethan's eyes were calm. "Maybe. But What's the point of keeping it if it costs who I am? She stared at him, trying to understand the peace in his voice. You're not afraid. He thought for a moment, then said quietly, for the first time, no. Something in her chest loosened. She took a slow breath, meeting his eyes again. There was a stillness between them, a fragile kind of understanding that felt both terrifying and right. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sun broke through for the first time in days, spilling gold across the frozen city. Ethan looked toward the window, then back at her. Sometimes the truth burns everything down, he said softly, but maybe that's the only way to start over. Clara followed his gaze, her reflection faint beside his in the glass. Two people standing in the light for the first time, not sure what came next, but knowing they'd stopped hiding. Down the hall, a nurse whispered something to another. A door closed gently, and in that quiet, Ethan Carter felt something unexpected. Freedom. It didn't roar. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived quiet and clean, like morning after a storm. He turned back to Clara, the faintest smile on his lips. Let's go home. But even as they walked down the corridor together, a thought lingered in her mind, one neither of them could yet say aloud. That love, once it stepped into the light, would never be safe again. The letter was only one page, folded neatly, handwritten in blue ink. Clara left it on Ethan's desk before sunrise, long before anyone else arrived at Carter Innovations. She had written it quietly the night before, sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, her hand trembling just enough for the ink to smudge at the bottom of her signature. It wasn't a long letter. She didn't have the strength for long goodbyes. Just a few words that cost more than she could afford to say aloud. Thank you for believing in me, but this is where I have to stop. She stood by the window for a long while after leaving it there, watching the early light crawl across the Chicago skyline. The glass reflected her face, tired, steady, and somehow lighter. She'd made her choice, and choices always came with loss. By noon. Ethan had read the letter 3 times. The paper was still warm from where his hands had held it too long. At first, he didn't believe it. Clara wasn't the kind of person who walked away without a word. But then he saw her handwriting the small, careful script that carried more grace than resignation, and something inside him tightened. He left his office without telling anyone where he was going. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and blooming flowers. Someone had left a small vase on the side table. Clara's mother was asleep, her breathing shallow but even. Clara sat near the bed, folding papers from her employer-provided insurance policy into a manila envelope. When the door opened, she didn't have to look up to know it was him. I told myself you wouldn't come, she said softly. I told myself I wouldn't, he replied. Silence settled between them, full of everything that couldn't fit into words. Ethan took a slow step closer. You didn't even give me a chance to talk you out of it. Clara looked up then, her eyes rimmed red from exhaustion. Not tears. That's the point. You'd try, and I can't let you. He frowned. Why? She drew a slow breath. Because Vanessa came here yesterday. Ethan froze. She what? She wanted to make sure I understood what would happen if I stayed. She said she'd leak every rumor, every private message, twist every photo until it looks like I took advantage of you. She said she'd drag you in this company through the mud, and when it's over, I'd lose my job, my reputation, and the insurance that pays for my mom's treatments. Clara's voice didn't break. It was calm, almost too calm. So, I'm ending it first. Ethan felt his chest tighten. She doesn't have that power. Clara met his gaze, steady. You and I both know she does. He shook his head, stepping closer. No, I won't let her use you as a weapon. You've done nothing wrong. I fell in love with my boss, she said quietly. That's enough for people to decide who I am. Her honesty hit him like a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He wanted to say something to deny it, to promise her safety, but the truth hung there, fragile and unyielding. He sat down in the chair opposite hers. "You're protecting me." Clara looked down at her hands. "I'm protecting what you built, what you still need, your company, your name, your future. I can't be the reason you lose it." He leaned forward. "Do you really think any of that matters to me right now?" She gave a small, tired smile. "It has to. Someone has to remember what matters." The sound of a heart monitor beeped softly in the background. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes drifting lazily against the gray sky. Ethan followed one with his eyes until it vanished into the sill. "Clara," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "You can't just disappear. Not like this." "I'm not disappearing," she whispered. "I'm stepping out of the way. That's the same thing." She shook her head. "No, it's the only thing I can still control." He wanted to argue, but there was something unshakable in her calmness, like she had already made peace with a decision that would break her. He reached across the small space between them, his hand closing around hers. "You shouldn't have to choose between love and survival." Her fingers trembled in his. "We don't always get to choose the timing." "Ethan." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet courage that came from fighting battles no one else saw. "I'll fix this," he said finally. "Whatever she's threatening, whatever she thinks she can do, I'll make it stop." She smiled faintly. "You can't fix everything? Watch me." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the hum of the heater, the slow rhythm of the monitor, and the faint whisper of snow brushing the window. Clara's voice softened. "Do you know what my mom told me once? She said real love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let someone stand where they're meant to be, even if it's not beside you." Ethan's hand tightened around hers. "And where am I meant to be?" She hesitated. "Out there, leading, living without having to apologize for who you are." He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "And you?" She looked down, her eyes shimmering. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere safe enough to breathe again." A long silence followed, then Ethan stood, reluctant, as if the act of leaving her side required more strength than any decision he'd made as a CEO. "Clara," he said quietly, "this isn't over." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "I know, but it has to be for now." He lingered by the door, looking back one last time. She sat by her mother again, her head bowed, her hand resting over the older woman's. The snow outside thickened, blurring the city beyond. Ethan wanted to go to her to tell her that love wasn't something you stepped away from, that some storms were worth walking through, but he couldn't. Not when she was protecting him from the very thing he had always thought he could control consequence. He left without another word. Clara listened to his footsteps fade down the hall. When the door closed, she pressed a trembling hand to her heart, as if trying to quiet it. Outside, the snow fell harder. Inside, the letter she'd left behind still sat folded in his pocket, ink smudged, edges creased, unreadable in places, but the last line was still clear. "Please understand, this is the only way I know to love you right now." He'd read it again later that night, standing by the window of his penthouse, the city glowing faintly below him, and for the first time in years, Ethan Carter didn't feel powerful. He felt human. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this wasn't the end. Just the quiet before something that would change everything again. The hospital at night had its own kind of silence different from the quiet of wealth or solitude. It was the silence of hearts waiting, machines breathing for those who couldn't, and prayers whispered into the dark. Clara sat beside her mother's bed, a book open in her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in hours. The monitors hummed softly, steady and patient, like a lullaby made of wires. Her mother had been doing better, stronger each day, but Clara's mind wouldn't rest. Every choice she'd made in the last week looped in her head like a film she couldn't stop replaying. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. A soft knock came at the door frame. She looked up and froze. Ethan stood there, No suit, no entourage, no walls, just him, a simple dark coat, his tie loosened, his eyes tired but certain. "Can I come in?" he asked. Clara's throat tightened. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He stepped closer, trying not to lose you. Her heart stuttered. "You shouldn't be here. The board, the press, Vanessa will." He cut her off, voice quiet but unshakable. "Let her talk. Let them all talk." She shook her head. "You don't understand? She's already started. There are articles, rumors, half-truths. They're saying I manipulated you, that you—" He moved closer. "Clara." His voice softened, but there was something new in it, something unbreakable. "I don't care what they say anymore. I'm done letting fear decide what kind of man I get to be." Her eyes filled, but she stayed still. "Ethan, please. I can't be the reason your name turns into a scandal." He exhaled slowly, looking down for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "You're not the reason. You're the truth that burned away everything fake around me." There was a pause, long enough for the monitors to become the only sound again. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, a small velvet box, worn at the edges, as if it had been in his hand all day. Clara stared. "Ethan?" He opened it. Inside. The ring wasn't extravagant. No diamond large enough to make headlines. Just a simple band of gold with a small, brilliant stone in the center. Timeless. Human. "Marry me," he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. "What?" He stepped closer. Every word steady. "Marry me." Not because it's easy, or safe, or what anyone expects, but because it's real. She shook her head, tears spilling before she could stop them. "You don't know what you're asking. This everything about us is chaos. It'll ruin your reputation." Ethan gave a small, tired laugh. "Then maybe my reputation deserves it, because I'd rather be ruined with you than perfect without you." Her voice broke. "Ethan?" He took another step. They were standing only inches apart now. His voice dropped, softer than a whisper. "You once told me your mom said love isn't about holding on. It's about standing where you're meant to be. Clara, this is where I'm meant to be. Here. With you." For a moment, all she could do was look at him. The way he knelt, not as a CEO used to commanding the world, but as a man stripped of everything but truth. The small chapel was just down the hall, a place she went sometimes when the machines and fear became too much. He gestured toward it now. "Come with me," he said. Clara hesitated, then nodded. They walked down the quiet corridor together. The chapel was empty, lit only by the soft flicker of candles near the altar. The faint scent of disinfectant still lingered, mixing with the wax and the cold air of night. Ethan knelt there, in that strange, holy quiet, surrounded by both sterility and grace. "I don't have a speech," he said. "Just a promise. I will take care of her, your mom. I'll make sure she has everything she needs. But more than that, I'll take care of you. Not because I owe it to you, but because I want to. Because I can't imagine a life where I don't get to see you smile." She covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming freely now. He went on, his voice breaking slightly. "The world is going to talk. Clara, they'll call it foolish, reckless, maybe worse. Let them. We'll show them what love looks like when it's brave." He took the ring from the box. "So, will you marry me? Not for safety, not for anyone else, but because it's us." Clara's hands trembled. For a heartbeat, everything went silent, the hum of the lights, the faint pulse of the machines down the hall, even the sound of her own breath. It was as if time itself held still, waiting for her answer. She looked at him. The man who'd built empires, broken expectations, and now knelt on a cold hospital floor, offering not perfection, but truth. Her voice came out small, trembling, but clear. "Yes, Ethan closed his eyes, a breath of disbelief leaving his chest. Then he stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and drew her into his arms. They stayed like that for a long time, the candles flickering softly, the rest of the world fading beyond those chapel walls. When they finally pulled apart, Clara laughed through her tears. "You just proposed to me in a hospital chapel." He smiled. "I figured love should start somewhere honest." She touched his face, her hand warm against his skin. "You really mean to turn this into something good, don't you?" "I do," he said simply. "We'll take the story they're writing about us and make it something different, something worth remembering." Clara looked at him, this man she'd once thought untouchable, now standing in the soft light of candles, ring on her hand, eyes full of hope. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and gentle, dusting the hospital windows with white. Her mother slept peacefully in the next wing, unaware that her daughter's life had just changed forever. And as Ethan and Clara walked out of the chapel, hand in hand, the flicker of light behind them made their shadows stretch long against the wall, two silhouettes, fragile and brave, walking toward a world that would never see them the same again. But for the first time, they didn't care. Love, once whispered, had finally been spoken out loud. The garden smelled like rain and new beginnings. 6 months had passed since that night in the hospital chapel, yet when Ethan stepped into the courtyard of the Cardiac Recovery Center, it felt as if time had simply paused and waited for them to arrive here. The morning air was cool, touched by spring, carrying the faint hum of bees drifting between blossoms. Everything was quiet, no photographers, no flashing lights, no noise of a world that once measured love in headlines. Clara stood near the rose bushes, the hem of her pale ivory dress brushing the soft grass. She had chosen it herself, a simple linen gown that caught the light like something soft and human. No jewels, no veil, just her mother's necklace resting against her collarbone. A gold locket Ethan had helped repair weeks before. Her mother sat by the window of the rehab center, wrapped in a shawl, watching with a faint smile. The nurses had helped her dress that morning. She had insisted on lipstick, saying every wedding deserved color, even if she couldn't walk down the aisle. Ethan's footsteps were quiet as he crossed the garden. For a man who once lived surrounded by glass and steel, he looked strangely at home among the flowers. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored but modest, his tie a soft shade of blue that matched the morning sky. When he saw Clara turn toward him, he forgot the rest of the world. "Hi," she whispered, smiling. "Hi." He breathed, as if it were the only word left that mattered. The ceremony was small, just a few chairs arranged beneath a white arch woven with wildflowers. A local chaplain from the hospital stood waiting with a worn leather Bible, his voice calm and kind. A handful of colleagues, a few close friends, and 2 of the nurses who had cared for Clara's mother filled the space. No reporters, no executives, no pretenses, only faces that belonged there. As the music began, a soft violin played by a patient's daughter, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Ethan turned, watching Clara walk toward him. Every step she took was quiet, certain, beautiful in its simplicity. He'd seen her in boardrooms, in snowstorms, in silence. But this was her truth. When she reached him, he took her hands. They were trembling slightly, though she smiled as if nothing else existed beyond that moment. The chaplain began to speak, his voice gentle over the hum of spring. "Love," he said, "is not the absence of hardship, but the courage to meet it with another heart beside your own." Clara glanced at Ethan, eyes glistening. He smiled softly. "That sounds like you." She laughed quietly under her breath, wiping a tear. When it came time for their vows, neither of them read from paper. Ethan went first. "I used to think love was something you controlled, something you protected from risk, from the world. But then you walked into my life, and you showed me it's the opposite. Love asks you to open every locked door and let someone see what's real." He took a breath. "So, Clara Reeves, I promise to never close those doors again. I promise to choose truth, even when it's hard, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel alone in it." Clara's tears fell freely now, though she smiled through them. When it was her turn, her voice was soft, steady. "I never wanted to fall in love with you," she said, and the guest chuckled quietly. "I thought you were everything I couldn't have: power, perfection, distance. But then I found out you were just human, and being human with you has been the most beautiful thing I've ever known." She squeezed his hands. "So, I promise to keep us human, to remind us of laughter when things get heavy, to build a home out of peace, not perfection." The chaplain nodded gently. "By the strength of your vows and the honesty of your hearts, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Ethan leaned in, kissed her gently, and the garden seemed to bloom brighter. Even the wind stilled for a heartbeat, as if the world itself paused to listen. Applause rippled softly, no cheers, no chaos, just warmth. Clara's mother clapped from her seat by the window, tears shining in her eyes. Ethan walked over to her afterward, still holding Clara's hand, and knelt beside the older woman. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak but full, "for loving her right." Ethan smiled. "Thank you for raising her that way." The reception that followed was less a celebration than a gathering of hearts. Someone played an old record on a portable speaker. Guests drank lemonade and coffee instead of champagne. A nurse brought out a small cake Clara had baked herself the night before. It leaned slightly to one side, but when Ethan cut it, he laughed. "It's perfect," and Clara laughed too, because it really was. Later that afternoon, they danced beneath a tree strung with fairy lights, barefoot on the grass, her head resting against his chest, his arms around her waist. The world beyond the garden didn't matter anymore. Somewhere beyond those walls, headlines had already changed their tune. The same magazines that once called it a scandal now called it a love that redefined power. Articles spoke of empathy and leadership, of how a billionaire learned that compassion was not weakness but strength. They called him the CEO with a heart. Ethan read none of them. He was too busy watching Clara laugh with the nurses, her mother smiling nearby, her hair catching the light. He didn't need redemption from the press. He had it right here in the sound of her voice, the steadiness of her hand, the life they had fought for without apology. As the day faded, the guests began to leave. The garden fell quiet again, the sky painted in soft shades of gold and violet. Ethan and Clara stood together, the last two left under the twinkling lights. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever stop being a story to people?" He smiled. "Maybe not, but that's okay, because we know the parts they'll never see." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light, like what he brushed a strand of hair from her face. Like this. He kissed her forehead, slow and certain. The sound of crickets began in the distance, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby for the day that had changed everything. And as night settled over the little garden behind the hospital, the world went quiet again. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace, the kind that comes when two people finally stop running from who they are and start building what they were always meant to have. Mornings by the lake had a rhythm of their own. Gentle waves lapped against the wooden dock, the water glimmering like brushed silver under the first light of dawn. In a small cedar house tucked behind a row of maple trees, Ethan Carter, once the face of power and precision, was now trying, in his quiet way, to learn how to live. The coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen. Clara stood barefoot by the counter, her hair still messy from sleep, pouring 2 mugs of coffee the way he liked black for him, with a hint of cinnamon for her. The smell filled the air, warm and earthy, blending with the faint sound of Oliver's paws patting across the floor. Oliver, a golden retriever they had adopted from a rescue shelter, had become the beating heart of their mornings. He followed Ethan everywhere, waiting at his feet when he worked, resting his chin on Clara's lap when she read. Sometimes, Ethan joked that Oliver was the one keeping the peace between 2 recovering perfectionists. Clara would smile and say, "Then let's keep him forever." They had lived here for nearly a year now, in a house smaller than Ethan's old penthouse, but infinitely larger in heart. The walls were lined with books and sketches, their kitchen table slightly scratched from use, their window always open to the scent of pine and rain. Ethan had kept his promise to rebuild Carter Innovations from the inside out. But it wasn't just a company anymore. It was a mission. He'd rewritten the core values, replacing the old slogan with 3 words that defined his new life: people before profit. Some thought it was naive. Others thought it was brilliant. He didn't care. For the first time, he led not from power, but from conviction. Every morning, before the world woke, he'd walk down to the dock with a mug of coffee, sit beside the water, and think not about market shares or mergers, but about meaning. Sometimes Clara would join him, wrapping herself in a shawl, sitting quietly beside him as the lake turned gold with sunrise. She had built something of her own, too. Her small consulting firm, Human First, worked with companies to build better cultures, places where empathy mattered as much as efficiency. At first, she ran it from their dining table. Now, she had a small office in town, filled with plants and books and the kind of laughter she said every workplace should have. Ethan loved watching her work, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about helping others find their voice. He once told her, half joking, "You're going to change the way people lead." She smiled and said, "Only if you promise to keep showing them how." Some days were quiet, filled with simple routines: grocery trips to the local market, walks through the park with Oliver, dinner cooked together to the sound of old jazz records. Other days, life still tested them: deadlines, fatigue, the weight of old habits creeping in. But even in those moments, they'd learned something neither had known. Before, peace wasn't the absence of chaos. It was learning to stand still in the middle of it, together. One evening, as autumn began to brush color across the trees, Ethan came home to find Clara sitting on the porch, typing on her laptop. Her glasses had slipped down her nose, and the last of the daylight painted her in gold. "What are you working on?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "An article. For the Leadership Journal. They asked me to write about what it means to build trust in business." He raised an eyebrow. "And what does it mean?" She paused, then closed the laptop gently. "It means showing up as who you are, not who the world says you should be." Ethan smiled. "You've gotten good at this." Clara leaned back, her eyes softening. "No," she said, "we've gotten good at this." That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire with their books. The only sound was the crackle of wood and Oliver's slow breathing at their feet. They didn't need words, just presence, just quiet. Ethan glanced at her across the firelight. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. She looked up. "Miss what?" "The noise, the spotlight, the rush." Clara smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but then I remember what it cost." She turned a page, her voice almost a whisper. "And what we found instead?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, what we found outside." The wind brushed through the trees, somewhere across the lake. A faint light flickered from another cabin, but theirs stayed dim and peaceful, like a heart beating slow and steady. As months passed, the world began to remember them differently. The scandal had become a story of redemption, retold in business schools and leadership summits. Ethan was invited to speak at a conference once, asked to share how he'd turned crisis into culture. He almost said no, but Clara convinced him. When the day came, he stood on that stage in front of thousands of strangers, his voice calm and unpolished. "I used to think success meant control," he told them. "Now I know it means connection. The most powerful thing you can build isn't a company, it's trust." When he returned home that night, Clara was waiting by the fire. She looked up from her book, smiled softly, and said, "You sounded like you meant it." He laughed. "I did. Every word." Later that night, as they got ready for bed, Ethan stood by the window, watching the moon ripple across the lake. Clara came up behind him, resting her chin on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He smiled. "Just how strange it is. I used to look out at the city lights and see ambition. Now I look at this lake and see peace. She nodded. Maybe you finally learned how to live slow. He turned to her, cupping her face gently. No, he said. I just learned how to live real. Clara smiled, eyes glimmering in the dim light. That's enough. They stood there for a while, quiet, breathing in sync with the soft rhythm of the water outside. Oliver stirred, lifting his head, then went back to sleep. The night stretched wide and calm, full of everything that didn't need to be said. And as the moonlight settled across the room, Ethan Carter, once the man behind glass walls, finally felt what he had been chasing all along. Not success, not power, but home. Zurich in spring looked nothing like the place they'd left behind. The snow that once covered the city like silence had melted into soft green hills and rippling blue water. The air smelled of rain and cherry blossoms, the same lake glimmering now under a gentler light. 2 years had passed. 2 years since the headlines faded, since the noise of judgment quieted into memory. 2 years since they'd chosen peace over perfection and found something better than either. Ethan and Clara walked side by side along the path by Lake Zurich, their hands brushing until they found each other and stayed. The same lake, the same air. Yet everything inside them had changed. Clara carried a small brown journal pressed against her chest, a proof copy of her book, Leading with Heart. The cover was simple, cream-colored, with her name printed in a font that looked almost handwritten. She had spent a year writing it, pouring into it everything she had learned not about power, but about people, about what it means to lead with empathy, to build bridges instead of walls. The publisher had wanted to call it the CEO's Muse. She refused. This isn't his story, she'd said softly. It's ours. Ethan had smiled when she told him that. It was never about titles anyway. Now, as they strolled under the cherry trees, petals drifted down around them like slow, pink snow. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, boats moving across the lake, laughter from a nearby cafe, the soft sound of someone tuning a guitar. Yet, within that world of sound, there was stillness. Ethan carried a small wrapped package under his arm. Clara hadn't asked what it was she'd learned long ago that he liked surprises delivered quietly. They stopped near the same bench where, years before, they had first sat together after that long flight. She smiled, recognizing it instantly. This spot, she said. Do you remember? How could I forget, he murmured. You were scolding me about empathy and leadership before we even landed. She laughed. And you were pretending not to listen. He looked at her, eyes soft. I stopped pretending a long time ago. They sat down. The water stretched out before them, shimmering with light. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. There are silences that feel like distance, and there are silences that feel like home. This was the latter. Then Ethan unwrapped the package. Inside was a small, weathered book bound in deep green leather. The pages were yellowed, edges soft from time. He handed it to her without a word. Clara turned it over in her hands, reading the embossed title. It was a collection of German poems, the same she had quoted from on their first trip together, when she'd spoken softly about love and purpose somewhere over the Atlantic sky. Her breath caught. You remembered? Ethan smiled. You said once that words can build bridges between people. I thought maybe we could walk across this one together. She opened the book. Inside, on the first page, he had written a single line in his neat, careful handwriting. For Clara, who taught me that strength begins with kindness. She blinked fast, swallowing emotion. You always know how to make me cry in public. He laughed quietly. Old habits. They sat for a long time, reading fragments aloud. The words floated between them like music, gentle, unhurried. A line about courage, a stanza about stillness, a verse about love, not as possession, but as presence. When the sun began to lower behind the hills, casting long ribbons of gold over the lake, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. I never thought we'd come back here, she whispered. I did, Ethan said softly. I just didn't know when it would feel right. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the water. You know what's strange? What I don't remember the pain anymore. I remember the lessons, the faces, the quiet moments, but the hurt feels like it belonged to someone else. He looked at her, thoughtful. Maybe it did. Maybe we outgrew it. She smiled faintly. Maybe. They sat there until the light turned soft and the petals began to fall faster with the evening breeze. Oliver barked somewhere in the distance, chasing a group of ducks near the dock. Clara laughed, calling after him, her voice echoing across the lake. Ethan watched her, the sunlight catching in her hair, and for a moment, he saw everything: the journey, the storms, the choices that had led them here, every misstep, every risk, every small act of courage that had built this quiet, extraordinary life. She turned back toward him, eyes bright, cheeks pink from the wind. What she asked, smiling. Nothing, he said, just thinking. How lucky I am that you got on that plane. Clara's smile softened. I almost didn't. Remember, I know, he said. That's the part that still scares me. She reached for his hand, fingers intertwining with his. Ethan, she said quietly, I think the best things in life aren't planned. They just happen. When we're finally brave enough to stop trying to control everything. He nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. Then she looked out across the lake again, eyes reflecting the last light of day. Sometimes, she whispered, the most beautiful journeys are the ones we never meant to take. For a long time after, they said nothing. The world around them faded into soft colors, the pink of the blossoms, the blue of the water, the pale gold of the setting sun. The wind carried the scent of spring, and in it, something else, something like forgiveness. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. So, he said, a small smile in his voice, where to next? Clara turned to him, eyes full of warmth. Home, she said simply, and together they stood. As they walked along the lakeside path, petals swirled around their feet, catching in their hair, clinging softly to their coats. The world felt light again, unrushed, unguarded, alive. Behind them, the last of the sunlight spilled across the water, shimmering like a memory that had finally found its peace. And somewhere between the laughter, the quiet, and the fading sound of footsteps on cobblestone, it became clear this wasn't an ending. It was the kind of beginning only love, tested and true, could create. Life rarely unfolds the way we plan it. Sometimes, what feels like failure or loss is only life's way of guiding us toward what truly matters. Ethan and Clara's story reminds us that success without peace is only noise, and love without truth is only a performance. We spend so many years chasing perfection, trying to appear strong, untouchable, in control. But in the end, it's the moments of honesty, kindness, and vulnerability that give life its meaning. Real strength is not in power or wealth. It's in the courage to stay human, to listen, to forgive, to start again, even after we've been broken. And sometimes, the most beautiful journeys are the ones that begin when we stop trying to control everything, when we let love lead instead of fear. For those of us who have lived long enough to know how unpredictable life can be, perhaps this story is a gentle reminder. It's never too late to choose what is real, to lead with heart, to find peace not in having more, but in being more patient, more compassionate, more alive to the quiet miracles that have been with us all along. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories tonight. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of love, courage, or the quiet beauty in everyday life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little warmth, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that it's never too late to live with kindness and heart. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep shining.